The notification popped up on my screen at 5:36 in the morning. Critical system failure. Database servers down. Production environment compromised. Automated alerts were flooding my phone. That familiar vibration I had felt 1,000 times over 17 years of service. My coffee sat untouched, steam rising in the quiet kitchen. On any normal Thursday, I would already be logged into the virtual private network by now, pulling up monitoring dashboards and firing off messages to the team. I had worked from home on Thursdays and Fridays for the past 3 years, a small concession the company made when I threatened to leave back in 2022. My home office setup was just as efficient as my desk downtown, but this morning was different. I stared at my laptop screen for exactly 15 seconds. Then I did something I had never done in my entire career. I closed it. My wife Clara appeared in the doorway, already dressed for her shift at the clinic. She looked at me, then at the closed laptop. She knew me better than anyone. 18 years of marriage meant she could read the tension in my shoulders, the way my jaw set when I was holding something back, but she also knew when to give me space. Our son Toby, who was 12 years old, was still asleep, but he would be up soon for school. Clara poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, studying my face. She asked if everything was all right. I told her that everything was fine and that it was just work stuff. My voice sounded calm, almost too calm. She did not push, but she lingered for a moment, squeezing my shoulder before heading down the hall to wake Toby. I watched my phone light up again on the counter. Another alert, then another. The system was melting down, and somewhere in a corner office, with a view of the city skyline, Preston Fowler was probably panic logging into his terminal. Preston was our newly appointed vice president of engineering. The same Preston who just 4 months ago could not debug a basic database serialization error without my direct guidance. My name is Julian Vance. I am 55 years old, and I have been a senior systems engineer at Nexus Grid Solutions for 17 years, 2 months, and 16 days. I built the infrastructure that runs this entire company. Every database configuration, every disaster recovery protocol, every network bridge that keeps our services alive. I either designed it myself or trained someone else to do it, and Preston Fowler was one of those people. He started as a junior engineer 15 years ago, fresh out of college with a degree that taught him computer science theory, but nothing about real-world database architecture. I taught him everything he knew. I stayed late helping him understand network replication, covered for him when he made rookie mistakes, and wrote glowing performance reviews that saved him from being laid off. I recommended him for promotions and vouched for his technical skills when executive management had doubts. Then came the company-wide town hall meeting 4 weeks ago. The chief executive officer, Nicholas Albright, stood at the front of the auditorium with a PowerPoint presentation about growth, restructuring, and strategic initiatives. My inbox had been buzzing all morning with messages from colleagues asking if I was ready to take the vice president role. I had hoped for it. 17 years of flawless performance reviews, 3 major database migrations that saved the company millions of dollars, and a reputation as the single point of contact for any system crisis. The promotion felt earned. Then Nicholas clicked to the next slide, and Preston's smiling face filled the screen. Nicholas announced that Preston's leadership potential made him the perfect fit for the role. The room erupted in applause. I clapped too, muscle memory taking over while my brain tried to process the betrayal. Preston stood up, shaking hands with the board members, and avoided looking in my direction. After the meeting, the Human Resources Director, Evelyn Hodge, called me into her office. She slid a thin folder across the desk and explained that they valued my technical contributions, which was why they were offering me an $18,000 retention bonus, paid out as $1,000 per month over 18 months. She explained that Preston's starting salary as vice president was $320,000, with stock options and performance bonuses, but my role was technical, not leadership. She said they needed me to stay and support Preston during this transition. Support him. The words tasted like ash. I signed the paperwork because I was too stunned to argue, and walked back to my desk in a daze. I found an email already waiting from Preston, sent to the entire engineering team. He thanked me publicly, calling my guidance invaluable, as if I were a helpful assistant rather than the person who built his career. Since then, I watched him move into the corner office, hire an executive assistant, and present my old database optimization reports to the board as his own ideas. I kept working, fixing bugs, and training new hires while my anger simmered. Until this morning. The alerts showed that the database transaction queues were backing up rapidly. Someone had pushed a massive configuration change to the production database without running the validation scripts. It was a rookie mistake, the exact kind of error I had spent 17 years preventing. I turned my phone face down on the kitchen counter. I was not going to log in. I was not going to save him this time. The house was quiet after Clara and Toby left. Toby had been excited about his science fair project, and Clara had promised to pick him up from school early. I sat at the kitchen table drinking a second cup of coffee and stared at my closed laptop. My phone was vibrating continuously on the counter, sliding a fraction of an inch with each new notification. By 8 in the morning, the missed calls began. The first call was from Preston Fowler. I let it ring. The second call came 3 minutes later, then a text message asking if I was seeing the database latency alerts. By 8:54, I had 9 missed calls from Preston, 5 calls from the infrastructure manager, and 4 calls from Evelyn Hodge in HR. The company's Slack channel was likely overflowing with emergency updates, but I had disabled the application on my phone the night before. At exactly 9 o'clock, the doorbell rang. I went to the front door and looked through the peephole. Preston stood on my porch, his face pale and his coat unbuttoned. He looked like he had run from his car. I opened the door but did not step aside to let him in. Preston stared at me, breathing heavily. He said we had a critical database outage and that the primary trading transaction cluster was locked up. He pleaded with me to log in, saying that $47 million in pending transactions were stuck in the database queue and that the system was completely unresponsive. I stood on the threshold, holding my coffee mug, and looked at him. I told him that he was the vice president of engineering now, which was a $320,000 a year job, and that this seemed like the exact kind of technical leadership challenge he was promoted to handle. His face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and anger. He reminded me that the company was losing thousands of dollars for every minute of downtime, and that the chief executive officer was demanding answers. He said I was the only one who understood the legacy database schema. I replied that he had a team of 12 developers, full documentation, and access to the same administrator tools that I did. I added that since he was the technical leader, he should have no problem resolving a simple configuration issue. Preston stammered, admitting that the documentation did not cover the custom failover routing scripts. I told him that I had spent 3 years writing and refining those custom failover scripts to automate database replication across 3 separate regional data centers. I explained how they validated network latency, handled network partitions, and prevented split-brain scenarios. But Preston had dismissed them during his first department meeting as legacy noise, replacing them with a generic off-the-shelf monitoring tool that cost $30,000 but could not handle our transaction database volume. I started to close the door, but he put his hand against the frame, begging me to tell him what I wanted. He asked if it was a matter of money and if a salary adjustment would get me to log in. I told him it was not about the money, but about the respect they had denied me. I closed the door firmly and locked it. I watched through the window as he stood on the porch for several minutes staring at his phone before walking slowly back to his sedan and driving away. I spent the rest of Thursday doing things I had not done on a workday in 17 years. I walked to the local organic market, enjoying the crisp autumn air on my face. I bought a cut of beef roast, fresh carrots, celery, and fingerling potatoes. Back home, I spent an hour browning the meat and chopping vegetables, letting the rich aroma fill the house. It was a meditative process, a complete departure from my usual lunch break of typing with one hand while holding a cold sandwich with the other. I picked Toby up from his middle school at 3 in the afternoon, and we went to the park to kick a soccer ball around. Toby looked at me with surprise, noting that I was usually glued to my laptop during his games. I told him that my priorities had changed. Toby told me about his science teacher who had praised his solar system model. He was talking excitedly, waving his hands, and for the first time in years I was actually looking at him, not checking my laptop under the table. When Clara came home from her shift at the clinic, the house smelled of stew, and Toby was finishing his homework at the dining table. Clara looked at me, a silent question in eyes. I took her hand and we sat in the living room while I explained everything. I told her about Preston showing up on our porch, the mounting missed calls, and my decision to stay off the system. Clara listened quietly, her hand holding mine. When I finished, she did not look worried. She said she had watched me sacrifice weekends, family dinners, and vacations for 17 years to support a company that treated me like an afterthought. She said she was proud of me for finally setting a boundary, and that whatever happened next, we would handle it together. Her support washed over me, releasing the residual guilt I had been carrying since closing my laptop. My phone, still silenced on the counter, continued to light up in the dark kitchen. By Friday morning, the situation at Nexus Grid Solutions had escalated into a full-scale corporate crisis. I woke up at 7:15 without an alarm, feeling more rested than I had in years. I checked my personal phone over breakfast. I had 35 missed calls and 64 emails. The most urgent email was from the Chief Executive Officer Nicholas Albright, sent at 10:28 the night before. The subject line read, "Urgent Operational Review." In the body of the email, Nicholas demanded that I call him immediately to discuss my future with the firm, stating that my failure to respond during a system emergency was a serious breach of duty. I set the phone down and ate pancakes with Clara and Toby. It was a beautiful, crisp autumn morning, and I felt completely detached from the panic brewing at the office. After dropping Toby at school, I returned home and checked my personal email. I had received a message from Sylvia Thorne, the senior accountant at the firm. The subject line was simply, "Thank you." Sylvia wrote that she had heard about the database collapse and the conflict over my promotion. She said, "Everyone in the finance department knew that Preston Fowler was unqualified and that I had been carrying the department for years." She mentioned that the trading floor was in complete disarray, with brokers shouting into their phones and senior partners pacing the hallways in absolute panic. She said it was clear that Preston had no control over the situation and was simply hiding in his office. Reading her email warmed me. It was validation that my colleagues saw the truth, even if the executives chose to ignore it. I wrote a brief, polite response, thanking her for her support and assuring her that I was doing well. At 9:24 in the morning, my phone rang again. It was Evelyn Hodge from Human Resources. I decided to answer. Evelyn's voice was tight and strained. She said the database had been down for over 28 hours and that they had been forced to bring in external consultants from an outside firm at a cost of $75,000. She said the consultants were struggling to understand the integration layers and that the company was facing significant regulatory penalties. She told me that Nicholas Albright wanted to meet with me in the office on Monday morning at 9 to discuss my concerns about my role and compensation. I told her I would be there on Monday and hung up. I spent the rest of Friday updating my professional profile and reaching out to recruiters. Within 3 hours, I had responses from 4 interested recruiters representing major technology firms. One was a recruitment firm in Boston seeking a principal database architect for a logistics firm, offering $240,000 base salary plus a $20,000 signing bonus. Another was a local cloud infrastructure startup, offering a competitive package with pre-IPO stock options. I replied to all of them, attaching my updated resume, feeling a wave of confidence. My skills were not outdated. They were the backbone of the industry. The market was hungry for systems engineers with my level of database experience, and the realization gave me immense leverage. I did not need Nexus Grid Solutions. They needed me. Over the weekend, I did not think about the office. We hosted a sleepover for Toby's friends, and I helped Roger clean out his garage. I existed entirely in the real world, away from server alerts and database queries. On Saturday afternoon, Clara and I took Toby to a local theater to see an adventure movie he had been talking about for weeks. We sat in the middle row, sharing a large bucket of buttered popcorn and laughing together. It was a simple activity, but one that felt incredibly luxurious because my phone was not vibrating in my pocket. I did not have to step out of the theater to answer an emergency call, and I did not have to spend the drive home worrying about server uptime. On Sunday morning, I made a hearty breakfast of blueberry waffles and bacon for the family, enjoying the slow pace of the weekend. On Sunday evening, I logged into the company's system log viewer, which I still had access to through my standard employee portal. I was curious to see how the external consultants had resolved the database lockup. As I analyzed the transaction logs, I noticed something strange. I accessed the system logs through my personal laptop, using my cached read-only auditor credentials which were not tied to the primary admin system. I scrolled through the event logs, searching for the exact moment of the configuration change. I found it at 5:36 on Thursday morning. A configuration change ticket numbered 924 had been pushed. It was signed off with my digital signature token, Vance Admin 17, but my user log showed my local system was completely offline. I checked the source IP address of the handshake. It was not my home router. It was Preston's corporate laptop, which had initiated the push from his hotel room. He had copied my administrator token from an old training folder I shared with him 2 years ago, using it to sign off on the database change without my knowledge. He had forged my digital authorization to bypass the verification protocol and push his disastrous database optimization. I downloaded the encrypted audit logs, the transaction timestamps, and the digital signature metadata, saving them to my personal drive. Under California Penal Code Section 470, forging a digital signature on a corporate system to bypass security controls is a felony. More importantly, it meant Preston had breached his fiduciary duty to the shareholders and violated federal financial regulations. I had the evidence I needed. Monday morning arrived, cold and clear. I put on my best charcoal suit, a clean white shirt, and a blue tie. Clara kissed me before I left, telling me to stand firm. I arrived at the Nexus Grid Solutions headquarters at exactly 9 in the morning, bypassing the early morning rushes I used to endure. I walked past the rows of cubicles, noticing the quiet panic on the faces of my colleagues. Owen, a junior developer, caught my eye and gave me a subtle nod of respect. I stepped into the elevator and rode it to the 24th floor. The executive conference room was surrounded by double-paned glass. When I walked in, I was met by the Chief Executive Officer, Nicholas Albright, the Chief Financial Officer, Graham Stone, Evelyn Hodge, and Preston Fowler. Preston looked as though he had not slept in days. His shirt was wrinkled, and his eyes were bloodshot. I remained standing, refusing to take a seat, which forced Nicholas to look up at me. Graham Stone started the meeting by sliding a single sheet of paper across the table. He said the total cost of the database outage, including consultant fees, lost customer transactions, and SLA penalties, was estimated at $3,400,000. He stated that my failure to log in on Thursday morning had directly contributed to this loss, and that the board was considering my termination for job abandonment. I looked at the paper, then back at Graham. I told him that under my contract and the Fair Labor Standards Act, my working hours were clearly defined, and my overtime had been officially cut. I was not on the emergency on-call list for Thursday, making my time my own. I was simply following the corporate cost reduction policies Preston had signed. Nicholas Albright leaned forward, his voice tight with anger. He was not used to being challenged by senior engineers and tried to interrupt me, stating that counsel would dispute my contract interpretation. But I remained calm, pointing out my agreement explicitly defined my hours and remote working conditions, and that Preston's memo had effectively relieved me of after-hours responsibilities. He said that as a senior systems engineer, I had a duty to protect the company's assets during a crisis. I opened my folder and pulled out the printed audit logs and the digital signature metadata I had collected over the weekend. I placed them on the mahogany table in front of Nicholas. I told him that the crisis was not caused by a system failure, but by a criminal act. I pointed out the digital approval signature on the change ticket that crashed the database. I explained that the signature was forged using my credentials at 5:36 on Thursday morning while I was offline. I stated that under California Penal Code Section 470, this was a clear case of forgery. I explained that the database log recorded the exact IP address and session token, proving Preston was the one who approved the change. I pointed out that his action had compromised the integrity of our financial systems, violating Section 404 of the Sarbanes-Oxley Act, which requires strict internal controls over financial reporting, exposing the company to massive federal compliance audits and shareholder lawsuits. The room went dead silent. Graham Stone picked up the documents, his eyes scanning the digital signature metadata. He looked at Preston, whose face turned a pale ash gray. Preston tried to stammer an excuse, saying he was trying to meet the implementation deadline, and that the validation scripts were taking too long, but Nicholas silenced him with a sharp gesture. Nicholas looked at Preston, his eyes cold and sharp as shards of ice, and asked him if this was true. Preston could only look at the mahogany table, unable to speak a single word of defense. I turned to Evelyn Hodge and stated that, if the company moved forward with my termination, I would immediately file a formal report with the Securities and Exchange Commission attaching the evidence of the security bypass and the forged authorization. I added that when the company threatened to lay off the junior database administrators to cover the $3,400,000 loss, they would also be violating the Federal Worker Adjustment and Retraining Notification Act, also known as the Warnin Act, which requires 60 days of advance notice for mass layoffs. Evelyn Hodge shifted uncomfortably in her chair, whispering to Nicholas that my legal argument was sound and that they could not afford a class action lawsuit from the employees. She noted that under the Warnin Act, the penalties for failing to provide notice were severe, including back pay and benefits for every affected employee, plus civil penalties of $500 per day of violation. The thought of adding regulatory fines to their existing $3,400,000 loss made Graham Stone's face tighten even further. I told them that Nexus Grid Solutions was facing a regulatory nightmare and that my departure would only make it worse. Nicholas Albright leaned back in his leather chair, rubbing his temples. He asked me what I wanted to resolve this situation. I told him I wanted Preston's job as the vice president of engineering, with a salary of $320,000 plus a 20% increase to compensate for the disruption, bringing my base salary to $384,000. I also demanded 5 weeks of paid time off and a written contract specifying that any after-hours administrative work would be compensated at an hourly consultant rate. I added that I wanted a public announcement of my promotion to the entire company. Nicholas Albright exchanged a long, silent glance with Graham Stone. The chief financial officer nodded slowly, recognizing that the cost of my demands was negligible compared to a federal investigation, a shareholder lawsuit, and a public collapse of their technology platform. Nicholas turned to Preston and told him to leave the room. Preston stood up, his shoulders slumped, and walked out without saying a word. The glass door clicked shut behind him. Nicholas looked back at me and said they would agree to my terms. We spent the next 2 hours drafting the letter of intent. Nicholas agreed to have the formal contract ready by Tuesday, incorporating all my terms. The contract also included a clause that protected my position from future arbitrary changes, specifying that any modifications to my compensation or authority would require a 90-day written notice and approval from the board of directors. Evelyn Hodge spent the afternoon updating the files, ensuring that the legal paperwork was completed without any errors. I had my personal attorney review the final draft on Tuesday evening, and she confirmed that it was a highly favorable agreement that gave me complete security and leverage. Preston was stripped of his authority immediately, his name removed from the engineering organization chart. He was moved to a research role in a small office on the second floor, far away from the executive suite and the engineering team, where he would have no access to the production databases. I told Nicholas I would sign the contract once my attorney reviewed it, and that I would begin my duties as vice president of engineering on Wednesday morning. On Tuesday afternoon, the company-wide email was sent to all 2,400 employees. It announced my promotion to vice president of engineering, effective immediately, citing my 17 years of service and deep technical expertise. It also mentioned Preston's transition to a research role. My phone was flooded with messages from engineers and database administrators congratulating me and expressing relief that someone who understood the technology was finally in charge. Sylvia Thorne sent me a brief note saying that justice had been served. My first official act as vice president was to hold a team meeting on Wednesday morning. I gathered all 30 engineers and database administrators in the main common area. I told them that the era of unpaid overtime and cutting corners was over. I introduced Owen and 2 other junior developers to the new peer review guidelines, explaining that we would build a culture of mutual respect and collaboration. I assured them that their voices would be heard and that no system changes would ever be pushed without proper testing and consensus. The relief in the room was palpable, and for the first time in months, I saw smiles on the faces of my team. I could see that by empowering them, I was building a stronger, more resilient department. I restructured the on-call schedule, providing fair compensation for any after-hours work and enforcing a strict policy that no system changes could be pushed without verified multi-signature testing. Nexus Grid Solutions filed a formal lawsuit against Preston Fowler for breach of fiduciary duty and contract violation, seeking damages for the $3,400,000 loss. The legal department used the forged digital signature logs I provided as their primary evidence, ensuring that Preston would face the consequences of his actions in court. He was officially dismissed from the company 2 weeks later. His career in the technology sector effectively finished. At home, my life settled into a healthy, peaceful rhythm. I no longer carried my laptop to the dinner table or checked my phone for database alerts in the middle of the night. I was present for Clara and Toby, attending Toby's soccer matches and science fairs without interruption. I had proven that 17 years of experience was a valuable asset, and that standing up for my boundaries was the most professional thing I could have done. 5 months into my new role, the database had experienced 0 downtime, and our transaction volume had grown by 20%. I sat in my office on a Friday afternoon, looking out at the city skyline as the clock neared 5. I shut down my computer, packed my leather bag, and stood up. I walked past the open desks of the engineering team, telling them to have a good weekend and to leave their work at the office. As I walked out into the cool autumn air, I realized that the best revenge was not just seeing Preston fall, but building an engineering culture where dedication was respected, boundaries were honored, and experience was recognized as the foundation of our success. The autumn leaves were turning gold and red, scattering across the parking lot. I drove home to my family, completely disconnected from the servers and finally at peace. When I arrived, Clara was in the kitchen and Toby was playing in the backyard. I hugged Clara tightly, whispering that everything had worked out. We spent the evening together, enjoying a quiet dinner and talking about our plans for the upcoming winter vacation. I had finally found the balance I had been searching for, and I knew that I would never let any company take it away from me again.